The city greeted them with noise, movement, and a kind of restless brilliance Jacob and Emily had never known. It was nothing like the village. Here the air didn't rest, it pulsed. Cars pushed forward like impatient river currents. Lights blinked all night. Street vendors shouted in a dozen accents, and towering buildings stretched into the sky as if trying to escape the very earth that made them. Emily held Jacob's hand tightly as they stepped off the bus. It had been a long journey, weeks on the road, pockets nearly empty, but hearts full of quiet resolve. In her bag, she still carried Margaret's faded ring and one of Jacob's carvings, wrapped gently in cloth. The sun in the city did not rise with the same quiet promise as it did in the village. It pierced the skyline like a spotlight, announcing that their new life had begun, ready or not. Their first apartment was small, tucked above a mechanic's garage. The walls were cracked, the air smelled faintly of oil, but the window overlooked the skyline, and at night, the city lights shimmered like stars learning to breathe again. Emily cooked with what little they had. Jacob carved in the evenings, filling the windowsill with new dreams made from soft wood. Their home had no luxury, but it had laughter. It had stories, and it had the quiet rhythm of two souls learning to survive in a world that barely paused long enough to see them. Jacob had arrived in the city with a letter in his hand and hope in his chest. His cousin Michael had promised him a position on a new agricultural engineering project, something meaningful, something that could build bridges between the past and the future. But within days of arriving, the message came. The project had lost its funding, government delays, private investors pulling out. The entire team dissolved before it began. Michael's voice had sounded heavy with guilt over the phone, but guilt could not pay rent. Jacob folded the letter quietly and placed it in a box beside his tools. He did not blame Michael. This was the city, fast-moving, unforgiving. Here, even the surest doors could vanish before you knocked. Emily found a nearby youth center and began volunteering, reading to girls, helping them with forms and language, teaching them that their voices mattered. Some laughed at her soft village accent. Others stared at her head wrap like it didn't belong. But day by day, a few began to stay after sessions. A few began to listen. In the evenings, Jacob and Emily would share quiet meals by the window, the city murmuring beneath them like an ocean that refused to sleep. Jacob often worked with his hands as they talked, carving new pieces that spoke more than he ever could aloud. On the windowsill sat a wooden sculpture of Emily, and beside it 2 intertwined trees. Beneath the trees, carved in small, careful letters, were the words, "No matter the soil, we grow." Jacob found work the way most desperate men do in the city, by swallowing pride. At the end of a long day knocking on doors and hearing the same polite rejections, he stumbled upon a cramped mechanical garage where a grizzled foreman wiped grease from his hands and sized Jacob up like a questionable tool. The pay was pitiful, the hours endless, and the tasks degrading. Yet when the foreman barked an offer without even meeting his eyes, Jacob said yes with a steady voice. His first assignment was to sweep the workshop floors, a mop in one hand and humiliation in the other. He moved among the workers like a ghost, enduring their jokes, their rolled eyes, their muttered insults. But as he swept, Jacob watched. He learned. Every bolt, every wire, every broken machine whispered secrets to him that the mockers could not hear. At night, he returned to their small apartment smelling of oil and defeat. Emily, waiting by the window with a warm plate of food, never asked if he had fixed a machine or just cleaned its shadow. Instead, she simply kissed his forehead and said, "Welcome home." Some nights Jacob would sit on the balcony, hands rough with blisters, carving bits of wood to keep his spirit alive. He shaped tiny figures, wrenches, wheels, bridges, symbols of what he would one day build. As the city roared below them, they clung to dreams louder than sirens, stronger than shame. The world mocked him now as a cleaner, a nobody, but Jacob knew. Real builders start by sweeping the dust others are too proud to touch. Meanwhile, Emily faced her own silent battles. Her outreach center, tucked between towering office buildings, drew curious glances and whispered doubts. People questioned why a young woman, barely settled herself, thought she could teach strength to others. Donations came in trickles, volunteers came and left like passing shadows. One afternoon, as Emily handed out flyers near a busy marketplace, a group of well-dressed women passed by, their laughter sharp and deliberate. She smiled anyway, her hands trembling only slightly as she clutched the last few flyers to her chest. They had left the village hoping to plant something beautiful here, but it seemed the city's soil was colder than they had ever imagined. Yet as dusk settled over the streets, Emily stood straighter, a small flame of defiance burning inside her. They had survived laughter before, they would survive it again. It started with a broken gearbox no one cared about. The rusty machine had been abandoned in a dark corner of the workshop, written off as useless by men who thought themselves too important to fix it. But Jacob, pushing his broom one evening after the others had gone home, noticed the way its gears still twitched stubbornly, refusing to die. Curiosity overruled exhaustion. He set down his broom, rolled up his sleeves, and knelt beside it. With calloused fingers he explored the wounded metal, seeing not failure, but potential. Hours passed unnoticed as he tinkered, adjusted, and reshaped. When the machine sputtered to life with a coughing roar, Jacob smiled, not a wide, foolish grin, but the quiet, fierce smile of a man who had just planted a flag in enemy territory. The next morning, chaos erupted. Workers gathered around the once-dead machine, whispering in disbelief. The foreman barked questions, his suspicion rising as Jacob shrugged modestly, claiming he had only cleaned a few parts. Praise from the other workers was laced with resentment. After all, it wasn't supposed to be the broom boy who revived the workshop's pride. Word traveled fast. By noon, Jacob was reassigned, not to fixing, but to observing other mechanics, a demotion in disguise. But Jacob understood the real lesson the city was teaching him. Here, brilliance was dangerous if it came from the wrong hands. Emily laughed softly that night when he told her, her voice full of pride. "They can bury the seeds," she whispered as they stood on the balcony under the stars. "But they cannot stop the rain." It was a rainy Thursday when Jacob first noticed the man in the long gray coat. While sweeping outside the garage during his lunch break, Jacob caught sight of him, leaning casually against a black car, arms folded, watching the workers come and go. His shoes gleamed even in the mud, and his umbrella was held not to shield from rain, but as if to mark his presence, a silent flag. For days afterward, Jacob would spot him again, sometimes reading a newspaper nearby, sometimes sipping coffee from a sleek silver flask. The others barely noticed. They were too busy jeering or fixing engines. But Jacob knew the city didn't waste expensive shoes on ordinary alleys. Someone was watching and waiting. The encounter came swiftly. One evening, as Jacob locked up the workshop, the man stepped forward from the shadows. His voice was smooth, unsettling in its familiarity, like silk hiding a blade. He introduced himself as Victor, said he had heard about a young man with clever hands and cleverer dreams, said opportunity could come faster if Jacob was willing to listen. Victor offered a small, knowing smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Jacob hesitated, every instinct screaming caution, but then Victor pulled out a business card, pressed it into Jacob's greasy palm, and disappeared into the night, leaving only the scent of expensive cologne and danger behind. Jacob stared down at the card under the flickering workshop light. No title, no company name, only a phone number, and one word carved beneath it like a dare: ascend. Jacob kept the card tucked in the back of his wallet for days, pretending he had forgotten it, pretending he hadn't memorized the number by heart. Life at the workshop continued, sweeping floors, repairing scraps, enduring laughter. But every so often, when a machine coughed stubbornly or a worker sneered too loudly, Jacob's fingers brushed the card in his pocket like a secret weapon. Then one evening, after a particularly brutal day of humiliation, he called. Victor's world opened instantly. A sleek black car arrived at the workshop, its driver ushering Jacob inside without a word. They drove to a glittering skyscraper where glass walls shimmered like captured starlight. Victor was waiting at the top floor, lounging in a chair so expensive it looked stolen from a king's palace. Around him, city magnates and sharp-eyed executives sipped wine and whispered over deals worth more than Jacob had ever dreamed of. Victor welcomed him with a smile, not as a servant, but as a guest of honor. Here, Jacob realized, the city had no memory of villages or mockery. Here, he could be anyone. As the night wore on, promises poured as freely as the champagne. Victor spoke of funding Jacob's inventions, of making him a name whispered in boardrooms and printed on magazines. All it would take, he said, was trust and loyalty. Jacob drank the offer in like a man dying of thirst, feeling the intoxicating pull of what could be. But somewhere deep in the back of his mind, a small voice, the one that sounded like Emily, whispered caution. Victor's smiles were too sharp, his promises too easy. Yet as Jacob stared out across the endless city lights, temptation pulled harder. For the first time since arriving in the city, Jacob wondered, what if the price of greatness was simply forgetting who you used to be? The first time Jacob missed dinner, Emily waited by the window until the stew grew cold. The city lights blinked beyond the glass like distant stars, but her world felt small, shrinking with each hour that passed. When Jacob finally stumbled through the door, his face flushed with excitement and champagne, he spoke quickly of plans and meetings and powerful new friends. Emily smiled, but her heart tightened with every unfamiliar name he mentioned, every polished word that sounded nothing like the man who used to carve her laughter into wood. He promised it was all for them, for the dream they carried from the village. But Emily saw something else flickering behind his eyes. Hunger. Nights blurred into weeks. Jacob's work shirts were replaced by pressed suits, his old calloused hands now scribbling on sleek tablets instead of sketching in grease and wood. Emily's outreach group, once his favorite evening topic, became a forgotten side note in their rushed conversations. Victor's world had swallowed him whole, and Emily was left standing on the shore, watching the tide pull him further away. One evening, after Jacob canceled yet another dinner to attend a very important meeting, Emily sat alone on the balcony, clutching one of Jacob's old wooden carvings to her chest. The city roared around her, loud and oblivious, but in her heart there was only a quiet, creeping question she dared not speak aloud. If success changed him too much, who would she be saving next? Victor's office was a temple to wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a conquered kingdom, and every chair, every table, every polished stone whispered power. Jacob sat across from Victor one evening, a thick folder placed carefully before him. Inside, Victor said with an easy smile, was the future. Contracts detailing funding, manufacturing, marketing, everything Jacob would need to turn his inventions into an empire. The numbers made Jacob's head spin. More money than he had ever seen, more promises than he had dared to dream. All it required was one small thing, signing over partial ownership to Ascend, Victor's private firm. Just a formality, Victor said, fingers tapping a gold pen against the desk. Just good business. Jacob stared at the paper, his heart pounding in his ears. On one side of the contract lay everything he had ever wanted, on the other, something nameless and precious he could not quite put into words. Back at the apartment, Emily waited, tracing the delicate carving of the intertwined trees on the windowsill. She felt it, something shifting, something dangerous. But when Jacob finally returned, his eyes were shining too brightly to question. He spoke of factories, workshops, his name etched into history. Emily listened in silence as Jacob described the contract he was thinking of signing, her heart sinking deeper with every word. She knew Victor's world was not built for men like Jacob, men who still carved hope out of wood and remembered every hungry face they ever loved. But the city was louder than her voice now. As Jacob held the golden pen in his hand, poised between two worlds, he didn't notice Emily's quiet tears glistening in the city light. He only heard Victor's promises and the roaring hunger inside himself. It was raining again when Emily's heart began to crack. She had gone to Victor's office unannounced, hoping to surprise Jacob with lunch, a small reminder of the world he was slowly leaving behind. The receptionist gave her a tight, practiced smile and asked her to wait. As Emily sat in the polished lobby, the coldness of the marble floors seeping into her bones, two sharply dressed men stepped out of Victor's glass conference room. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices curling like smoke through the sleek hallways. Emily wasn't meant to hear them, but as she adjusted her seat, the words drifted toward her, sharp, unmistakable. "He's naive, a real country fool. Let him build it, we'll gut him after the patent's clear. Victor's playing the long game. Once the deal's sealed, he's disposable." Emily froze. Her pulse hammered against her ribs as she lowered her gaze, pretending not to listen. The men chuckled cruelly and walked away, their expensive shoes tapping hollow notes against the stone. For a long moment, Emily couldn't move. The glossy floors, the towering glass walls, the shining city beyond the windows, all of it blurred into a single, brutal truth. Jacob wasn't being lifted up. He was being led to slaughter. By the time Jacob appeared, laughing and glowing from another meeting, Emily had already hidden the shaking in her hands. She smiled. She kissed his cheek. She offered him the lunch she had packed with trembling fingers. But inside, her mind raced, stacking pieces of a dark puzzle she could no longer ignore. That night, while Jacob slept, Emily sat by the window, clutching the worn carving of their two trees. She stared into the city's glittering heart and whispered a prayer into the cold air, not for success, not for riches, but for the strength to fight for the man she loved, even if it meant standing against him. The next morning, Emily found Jacob already dressed in a sharp new suit, his reflection a blur of ambition in the cracked bathroom mirror. He barely touched his breakfast, flipping through glossy brochures that promised factories, awards, interviews. His dreams now had polished floors and marble walls, and Emily, sitting across from him in her simple dress, felt like a threadbare memory in a world he was racing toward. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to speak the words that had knotted inside her all night. "I think you should be careful, Jacob. I overheard something at Victor's office yesterday." Jacob barely looked up. His hand moved lazily over the papers, tapping numbers and figures with the casual excitement of a man too far inside his own dream. When she pressed further, his smile faded. He told her not to worry. He said success always attracted jealousy, that the city was full of bitter whispers. His voice was soft, but there was a new edge beneath it, an impatience Emily had never heard before. An invisible wall had risen between them, built not of anger, but of something colder, ambition. That night, Jacob didn't come home until late. Emily sat by the window again, the city buzzing with neon dreams she no longer believed in. When he finally stumbled in, tired and smiling with success, Emily wrapped her arms around him anyway, burying her fears inside her chest. Love was not always loud, she reminded herself. Sometimes it was the quiet choice to stay even when the ground trembled beneath your feet. But as she listened to Jacob breathing beside her in the dark, his dreams whispering his name louder than hers, Emily wondered if loving him would soon mean fighting not just the world, but the very man she had vowed to stand beside. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Jacob sat in Victor's office once again, sunlight pouring through the glass walls in arrogant rivers, making the golden pen gleam like a weapon. Across the table, Victor smiled with the patience of a man who had already won. The contract sat between them, thick and waiting. Jacob's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the pen. Somewhere deep inside, Emily's voice still whispered warnings. Somewhere even deeper, the memory of dusty village roads and wooden carvings tugged at his sleeve. But louder than all of it was the roar of the city's promise, success, recognition, power. With a breath he would later wish he could take back, Jacob pressed the pen to the page and signed his name. The deal moved quickly. Cameras flashed. Hands were shaken. Articles were written about the rising genius from nowhere. For the first time since he arrived in the city, Jacob walked down the street and saw his name on posters. He smiled at strangers who smiled back, not with mockery, but with admiration. But beneath the surface, shadows began to stir. Small clauses buried in thick paragraphs, shifts in ownership paperwork, meetings he was no longer invited to. Invitations that once flowed freely now narrowed into exclusive rooms where only Victor's closest partners gathered. Jacob didn't notice. Not yet. He was too busy chasing the dream he thought he was building. But Emily noticed. Every night she watched him return, his face brighter, his touch colder. The man who had once built sculptures from love was now sculpting himself into something the city could devour. The first sign came in the form of a letter. Thick, official, and cold. Jacob tore it open eagerly at first, expecting congratulations or invitations. Instead, he read words he barely understood at first: transfers of ownership, patent reassignments, restructuring of assets. His hands tightened around the paper as realization dawned. His invention, the one birthed from nights of scraping and carving and dreaming, no longer belonged fully to him. Ascend Corporation, Victor's empire, now claimed a lion's share. Panic clawed up Jacob's throat. He rushed to his phone, dialed Victor's number, demanded explanations, but Victor's secretary answered instead, offering polite apologies and promising callbacks that never came. When Jacob told Emily he expected comfort, instead she listened in silence, her face unreadable. When he finished, a heavy, broken quiet filled the room. Emily rose from the couch, walked to the window, and pressed her forehead against the cold glass. She had warned him. She had begged him to be careful. But he had chosen ambition over caution, pride over partnership. Without turning, she whispered words so soft they almost dissolved in the city noise outside. "You traded your soul for a seat at their table, Jacob, and they never intended to let you stay." Jacob sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. For the first time since stepping into the city's light, he realized he was more lost now than he had ever been in the village's dust. Days blurred into weeks, weeks blurred into months. The apartment grew quieter with every passing sunrise. Jacob still woke early, still dressed neatly, still left for the day as if chasing purpose. But there were no more posters, no more interviews, no more sparkling invitations. His name had been stripped from the inventions he birthed, swallowed whole by Ascend's vast machinery. He was an invisible man in the city he once believed he could conquer. Emily stayed too, her days spent at the small outreach center that struggled to stay open, her nights spent sitting by the window carving hopes into silence. They spoke little, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion, the kind that comes when dreams die slowly, not all at once. Some nights, Jacob would sit alone on the balcony, carving tiny pieces of wood into shapes he no longer bothered to name. A gear here, a bridge there, hands working out of habit, not hope. Emily watched him sometimes through the glass door, her heart aching with a sadness too deep for words. She loved him still, deeply, fiercely, but she mourned the man he used to be. Sometimes she wondered if the city had not taken Jacob's invention alone, but Jacob himself. And yet, despite the walls that had grown between them, despite the silent meals and heavy evenings, they stayed. Two broken branches twisted together by a promise made long before success or failure. Love did not always roar like the city. Sometimes it simply endured. It happened on a Tuesday, in the kind of rain that washed even the city's filth clean for a few sacred hours. Jacob was fixing a broken fan at the outreach center where Emily worked, a favor to one of the girls who had shyly asked for his help. His hands, though rough and tired, still knew the language of broken things. As he adjusted the gears, an idea sparked. Small, stubborn, undeniable. It was not grand like the blueprints Victor had dangled before him. It was simple, practical, a low-cost, durable tool that struggling workers across the city could use, something no corporation would bother to make because it would never bring in millions. But it could change lives. Jacob's fingers trembled slightly as he sketched it out on a scrap of paper. For the first time in what felt like years, he felt not ambition, but purpose, raw, honest, and blazing from within. When he showed it to Emily later that night, her eyes widened. She touched the paper gently, tracing the rough lines with trembling fingers. It was not fame he was chasing this time. It was the boy who once carved hope into wood, the boy she had believed in when no one else did. Without words, Emily crossed the small room and wrapped her arms around him. They stood there, surrounded by unpaid bills and peeling walls, holding not each other's brokenness, but each other's beginnings. News of Jacob's small invention traveled faster than he expected. Whispers grew into conversations. Conversations grew into interest. Before long, curious faces began appearing at the outreach center. Strangers who were not so strange after all. They wore city clothes now, sleek and shiny, but Jacob recognized them instantly. Faces from the village. Men and women who once laughed as he stumbled through the market, who had sneered when he stood silent at the back of the gatherings. Now they approached with wide smiles and outstretched hands, their voices dripping with sudden affection. "We always knew you would make us proud," they said, their words sweet as overripe fruit. Some claimed to have encouraged him from the beginning. Others spun wild stories about how they had secretly supported his dreams all along. They praised Emily, too, calling her brave and wise, as if their past cruelty had never existed. Jacob stood stiffly among them, the papers for his invention crumpling slightly in his sweating hand. Emily stayed close, her fingers brushing his as a silent warning. The city had not changed these people. It had only taught them how to smile when they wanted something. That night, Jacob sat by the window, staring out at the sprawling city. The villagers' words buzzed in his ears like persistent flies. Some had hinted at partnerships. Others spoke of introductions to important friends. All of them wrapped their greed in the same bright paper of community and loyalty. Jacob knew the truth now. Success, even the smallest spark of it, attracted not only friends, but vultures. And if he was not careful, the same hands that once pointed at him in scorn would soon tighten into fists around everything he had fought to build. It started small, a missing file here, a delayed shipment there. At first, Jacob thought it was just the chaos of growing attention, but as days passed, the problems grew sharper, more targeted. Someone was sabotaging the little project he had built from dust and prayers. Someone who knew exactly where to press the blade. Late one evening, as he reviewed documents in the outreach center's cramped office, Jacob found the answer buried in a report, a familiar signature scrawled at the bottom of a funding request he had never authorized, a signature belonging to someone he once called a neighbor, a childhood face from the village now dressed in city silk. The betrayal tasted bitter in his mouth. This man, once a boy who laughed loudest when Jacob stumbled, had wormed his way into the new venture under the banner of loyalty. And now, partnered with Ascend's silent claws, he was trying to seize everything Jacob had rebuilt. Jacob clenched the paper so tightly it tore between his fingers. Trust was a currency he could no longer afford to spend blindly. When he told Emily, she was not surprised. She listened quietly, her face calm but her eyes burning with a familiar fire. "We cannot fight them the way they fight us, Jacob," she said, her voice steady as stone. "If you want to save what you built, you must be smarter, not louder." Jacob nodded slowly, the anger boiling in his chest cooling into something sharper, deadlier. He had tried playing by the city's rules once. Now he would write his own. The knock came just after midnight, sharp and urgent, slicing through the quiet like a blade. Jacob and Emily sat frozen in the living room, papers and blueprints still spread across the floor between them. Without a word, Jacob rose and opened the door. 3 men stood outside, faces grim beneath the harsh flicker of the hallway light. Men he once shared firewood and childhood secrets with. Men who now wore expensive watches and city smugness like armor. They came with papers, official, stamped, and cold. They claimed Jacob's invention was no longer his. They claimed signatures he had never made, deals he had never seen. A partnership quietly shifted behind his back, a theft wrapped in legal silk. Jacob's heart hammered as he scanned the documents, rage and disbelief fighting for air. Emily stood behind him, silent and still, her hand resting lightly against his back as if to anchor him to the floor. They left as quickly as they had come, their laughter echoing down the stairwell. Jacob closed the door slowly, the lock clicking like a death sentence. He leaned against it, his body trembling with the weight of betrayal. Emily gathered the scattered blueprints from the floor, her movements slow, deliberate. This was not just ambition gone wrong. This was war. And for the first time, Jacob realized that survival would demand more than skill, more than dreams. It would demand a heart willing to break and still keep beating. As the city pulsed with indifference beyond their thin walls, Jacob and Emily sat together on the floor, surrounded by stolen dreams and the stubborn, quiet vow to fight for them anyway. The betrayal left scars, but it also cleared the illusions from Jacob's eyes. For days, he and Emily pored over every contract, every letter, every forgotten clause. They slept little, ate less, surviving on black coffee and stubborn hope. The city outside their window moved on without noticing, glittering cold and uncaring. But inside their tiny apartment, something fierce was being born. Jacob was no longer the boy who begged for a seat at powerful tables. He was a man who would build his own. It was Emily who found the crack in the wall. Late one night, after hours of reading legal documents until her vision blurred, she pointed to a small line buried deep in the original paperwork. A loophole. A forgotten condition that, if challenged, could tear apart the false ownership claims. Jacob stared at the clause, hope flickering alive in his chest. It would not be easy. It would mean public fights, courtrooms, media storms. But it was a weapon, and they had nothing left to lose. As the first pale light of dawn crept into the room, Jacob and Emily clasped hands over the battered table, not as victims, but as warriors ready to reclaim what had been stolen. They began quietly, gathering evidence, finding witnesses, reaching out to honest lawyers willing to take on a fight against powerful enemies. Every move was deliberate, calculated, fueled not by rage but by a deeper fire: justice. The city had laughed when they stumbled, had turned its back when they cried. Now it would watch as they rose from its ashes, stronger than the dreams it tried to steal. Jacob glanced at Emily one night as they finalized their plans. She met his gaze, fierce and unyielding. Whatever came next, they would face it together. They started small: a few battered tables, a leaking roof, and a handful of city workers who believed in second chances. Jacob opened a tiny workshop on the edge of the poorer districts, far from the skyscrapers and shining offices where he once dreamed of standing. Word spread quickly, not through glossy advertisements or media campaigns, but through whispered recommendations and grateful handshakes. Here was a place where broken machines found life again. Here was a man who did not wear suits or speak in polished lies, but whose hands built truth into steel and wood. Emily worked beside him, managing the accounts, organizing the workers, teaching young apprentices who had been forgotten by the city's cold streets. They paid themselves little, investing everything back into tools, repairs, people. At night, they would sit under the cracked ceiling lights, counting coins by hand, laughing quietly at the stubborn miracle of it all. It was not glamorous, it was not easy, but it was real. For the first time in a long time, Jacob felt the weight in his chest lift, not because the city had given him anything, but because he had finally learned how to build without needing its permission. The invention that had once been stolen from him now lived in a different form, simpler, cheaper, stronger, built for the people, not the powerful. Workers across the city's poorest neighborhoods began using Jacob's tools, telling stories of how a quiet man with tired eyes and a stubborn heart had made their lives just a little easier. Jacob would watch them sometimes from the doorway, a simple smile tugging at his mouth. He no longer needed the city's approval. His legacy was being built in calloused hands, in fixed engines, in the laughter of boys who learned to weld their futures from broken scraps. It was a dream that no contract could steal. It started with a single article in a small local newspaper. A young journalist, assigned to write about forgotten neighborhoods, stumbled into Jacob's workshop and left carrying more than just a story. He carried hope. His article spoke of a man who had turned betrayal into blueprints, loss into legacy. The story caught fire faster than Jacob or Emily could have imagined. Within days, larger news outlets came calling. Photographers crammed into the tiny workshop, snapping pictures of greasy machines and wide-eyed apprentices. Jacob and Emily stood side by side, blinking under the sudden blaze of attention, wary but determined. They gave few interviews, always together, always cautious. Jacob spoke not of riches or fame, but of community, of rebuilding broken things and broken people. Emily, graceful but firm, steered conversations away from flashy headlines and back to the hands that mattered, the workers, the forgotten dreamers. Fame had found them again, but this time they did not chase it. They simply opened their doors, kept their heads low, and let their work speak louder than any microphone could. Across the city, people whispered their names, not as punchlines or cautionary tales, but as examples. Investors, politicians, even former enemies sent invitations, trying to catch the rising wave. But Jacob and Emily chose carefully, building partnerships with those who believed in the work, not just the glory. They had learned the city's cruel lessons well. Trust was no longer given lightly. Each day, as the workshop grew stronger, as laughter returned to dusty rooms and dreams found new breath, Jacob and Emily stood as living proof that true success did not come from climbing over others, but from lifting as many as you could with you. Victor had watched quietly from the shadows, nursing his bitterness like an old wound. Every article praising Jacob was a blade twisting deeper. Every success story was a slap to his pride. When whispers reached him that Jacob's new invention, simple, sturdy, unstoppable, was being adopted across the poorer districts, Victor knew he had to act. Not with contracts this time, not with polite betrayals. He needed destruction. It began with rumors, ugly, persistent lies spreading through newspapers and back-alley meetings. They said Jacob had stolen his designs. They said his workshop was dangerous, unsafe, built on stolen money. Then came the inspections. Officials showed up unannounced, flashing badges, digging through tools and paperwork, hunting for any excuse to shut them down. Suppliers pulled out, scared by the sudden storm of bad press. Jacob stood in the middle of the chaos, feeling the ground he had rebuilt start to tremble again. He knew without asking. Only Victor had the power and the malice to orchestrate something this ruthless. At night, Jacob and Emily sat together at the kitchen table, their hands wrapped tightly around chipped mugs of tea, the news clippings and warning letters piled high between them. Emily's voice was steady as she spoke, mapping out their next moves. This was no longer about protecting just an invention. It was about protecting every boy who had learned to weld because Jacob believed in him, every family who had repaired their broken engines and found new life because of his stubborn hope. Victor could spread lies, he could send fear, but he could not erase what had already been planted in the hearts of the people. Jacob looked at Emily across the cluttered table, exhaustion carving deep lines into both their faces. He saw no fear in her eyes, only fire. The city buzzed with rumors, sharpened by greed and whispered with delight by those who had once doubted Jacob. For days the workshop fought to stay open, drowning in accusations and fear. It was Emily who saw the truth first, not in the lies themselves, but in the fear they created. Fear was Victor's weapon, and it could be broken. She gathered the workers one evening under the cracked roof of the workshop, their faces pale and tired under the flickering lights. She spoke not with anger, but with calm, steady fire. She told them the story behind the invention they repaired every day. The betrayals, the stolen dreams, the battles fought in silence. She spoke of resilience, of refusing to bow to men who built empires by breaking others. She reminded them that the workshop was never about Jacob alone. It was about every hand that had lifted a broken thing and made it whole again. The next morning, something extraordinary happened. Workers arrived early, setting out their tools without waiting for instructions. Families from nearby neighborhoods came to sweep the streets and repaint the faded signs. Local newspapers, tired of the lies, came to hear the real story from the people themselves, and Emily stood at the center of it all, fielding questions, showing paperwork, offering quiet, unstoppable proof that what Victor had tried to destroy was already bigger than him. When Victor's spies came sniffing around, they found not a crumbling workshop, but a thriving fortress of loyalty and community. Emily watched from the doorway, arms crossed, her face calm and unmovable. They had tried to silence her husband. They had tried to erase their legacy, but they had forgotten something powerful. A man can be broken, but a cause built on love and sacrifice is nearly impossible to kill. The city that once ignored their suffering now watched their triumph unfold like a slow, glorious sunrise. Armed with evidence, testimonies, and the fierce loyalty of the people he had once tried to crush, Jacob filed charges against Ascend Corporation and Victor himself. The court hearings were brutal and public. Reporters camped outside the gray stone courthouse, cameras flashing like desperate insects, hungry for every detail. Victor sat stiffly in the defendant's chair, his once sharp suit rumpled, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. As the evidence was laid bare, fraud, manipulation, illegal contract alterations, his empire crumbled piece by piece. Witness after witness stood, voices steady, speaking of betrayal and lies, speaking of how Victor had tried to bury a man who simply wanted to build. Emily sat in the front row every day, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her presence a silent wall of strength behind Jacob. The final ruling came on a cool Friday afternoon. The judge's voice was clear and unshakable. Victor was found guilty of fraud and ordered to pay heavy damages. More importantly, Jacob's invention was returned fully to his name. The courtroom erupted into quiet applause, not the wild cheers of a stadium, but the slow, heartfelt clapping of people who knew what it meant to bleed for a dream. Jacob turned to Emily, his eyes bright but wet, and she simply smiled, the kind of smile that said everything without speaking a word. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed them. Microphones pushed forward, shouts filled the air. Jacob raised a hand for silence, then spoke softly, so that only those willing to listen carefully would hear. "This was never about winning," he said. "It was about not giving up on the things worth fighting for." Then he reached for Emily's hand, and together they walked down the courthouse steps into a future they had rebuilt with broken hands and unbroken hearts. Victory did not change Jacob and Emily, it revealed them. With the damages awarded from the lawsuit and the fresh attention their story had earned, they had a choice. They could finally live comfortably, quietly, away from the battles and noise. But comfort had never been their true dream. Instead, they built something greater. The small workshop became a foundation, not just for machines, but for people. They opened schools where abandoned children learned trades. They funded programs teaching young dreamers how to invent, create, rebuild. They partnered with communities the city had long forgotten, pouring their resources into hands that were once empty. Everywhere Jacob and Emily went, they planted seeds, stubborn, beautiful seeds, of resilience and hope. And wherever those seeds grew, they left behind something more powerful than any invention. They left behind the belief that broken things could be made whole again. They kept little for themselves, a modest house near the old workshop, a battered truck that Jacob stubbornly refused to replace. Late at night, after the noise of the day faded, they would sit together on the porch, watching stars blink into existence above the sleepy city. Emily would rest her head on Jacob's shoulder, and he would run his thumb over the worn carving she still kept in her pocket. The two trees intertwined, stubborn and strong. They had been mocked, betrayed, torn apart, but they had refused to break. And now, they had built something that would outlive them both. A legacy not carved in marble or gold, but in every heart that dared to dream again. Years later, when strangers spoke of Jacob and Emily, they spoke not of the battles they won, but of the battles they chose to fight with grace. Their names became whispers of hope in city streets and village paths alike. New workshops blossomed where once there was only silence. New dreams grew in soil once thought barren. And though wealth came knocking many times, Jacob and Emily remained where their story began, in the heart of the people. Their modest home stood behind the old workshop, now expanded into a thriving center of innovation and learning. Children raced through its halls carrying blueprints and toolboxes, laughing freely under banners that read, "Build what you cannot find." Jacob often watched them from his chair on the porch, a contented smile hidden beneath his graying beard. Emily, ever his anchor, would sit beside him, her hand tucked securely in his, the same way it had been on the dusty village road so many years before. Sometimes, when the sky grew dark and the stars blinked awake, Jacob would wonder what new storms might come. New enemies, new tests. Life had a way of circling back. But when he turned to Emily and saw the quiet strength still burning in her eyes, he knew they were ready. Whatever the future held, they had faced the fire before, and emerged not burned, but forged. Far across the city, in a gleaming tower where the rich plotted their next empires, new names whispered in polished halls. Men who had learned nothing from Victor's fall, eyes gleaming with the same hunger that once tried to devour Jacob's soul. But the story was not finished, and somewhere, beneath the rising hum of new beginnings, destiny stirred once more. Jacob squeezed Emily's hand, his voice low and certain as the night wrapped around them. "We are just getting started. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more."